Imagine this: while your husband is lying on his deathbed, your own daughter secretly forges your signature to mortgage your house, stealing everything you've worked for your entire life. And the man she calls her husband? He's the mastermind, using a shell company to swallow up the money. This isn't just family betrayal, it's a calculated financial conspiracy. But Marianne, the mother they thought was weak, rose up, fought back, and forced her betrayers to face justice. This is a story of betrayal, of justice, and of the unbreakable strength of one woman. The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to Marianne's clothes as she sat by her husband's hospital bed, listening to the faint hiss of the oxygen machine. Arthur's breathing was shallow, his once strong hands now frail against the white sheets. 47 years of marriage had brought them joy, hardships, and countless sacrifices, but in this quiet room, everything seemed to be slipping away. It was in this fragile moment that Sophia appeared, her voice uncharacteristically brisk, her eyes avoiding Marianne's. "Mom," she began, not with comfort but with calculation, "I need you to stay calm when I tell you this." Marianne looked up, already sensing a storm. "The house, it's been mortgaged. $285,000. Daniel needed the capital for his company, Green Horizon. It was the only way." For a moment, Marianne thought she had misheard. The house, the very home she and Arthur had worked decades to pay off, the place where every corner carried memories, was now collateral for her son-in-law's risky venture. Her chest tightened. "What are you saying, Sophia? How could you, without even asking me?" Her voice cracked, both from exhaustion and betrayal. Sophia shifted uneasily, her tone growing defensive. "It's just paperwork, Mom. Daniel's company will succeed, you'll see. This is an investment in the future. Our future." But Marianne heard only the hollow echo of betrayal. She remembered the nights she had gone without new clothes so Sophia could attend private school, the vacations she had sacrificed so her daughter could chase dreams. And now, as she clutched Arthur's hand, barely able to feel the warmth of his skin, Marianne realized the unthinkable. While she had been watching her husband slip closer to death, her daughter had been stealing the very roof over her head. The monitors in the room beeped steadily, but Marianne felt as though the ground beneath her had collapsed. Her daughter's words were not just shocking, they were a knife, cutting through what little strength she had left. And for the first time, she understood that the battle she was about to face would not be against grief alone, but against her own flesh and blood. The hospital became Marianne's second home. She barely left Arthur's side, sleeping in a stiff plastic chair, waking at every cough or movement, holding his hand as though her presence alone could keep him tethered to life. Nurses admired her devotion, whispering about the rare kind of love that could endure such relentless nights. But while Marianne's world shrank to the four white walls of the hospital room, Sophia's visits were fleeting. She appeared every few days, impeccably dressed, her phone always buzzing, her eyes glazed with impatience. She brought no fresh flowers, no warm meals, no real comfort, only empty reassurances. "Mom, don't worry. Daniel and I are taking care of everything." What Marianne didn't know then was that Sophia was indeed taking care of everything, but not for her parents' sake. Behind closed doors, Sophia rifled through Marianne's drawers, collecting birth certificates, old tax forms, and bank records. She practiced forging her mother's elegant signature until the letters curved just right. With Daniel's guidance, she met with a notary, papers already prepared, each one binding the family home to a loan Marianne had never consented to. 47 days, that was all it took. While Marianne prayed for her husband's healing, her daughter dismantled decades of security and trust. The betrayal was not only in the forged ink or the stolen documents, it was in Sophia's absence. She never once sat through the long nights of coughing fits, never once whispered words of love into her father's fading ears. Instead, she let her mother carry the weight alone, while she carved out a future built on lies. One night, as Marianne looked at Arthur's fragile face bathed in pale moonlight, she felt a piercing ache in her chest, not just from grief, but from realization. The daughter who once held her hand at the park, who cried in her lap after heartbreaks, who promised she would always be there, was gone. In her place stood a stranger in familiar skin, someone who valued profit over blood, ambition over family. And Marianne knew, with growing dread, that when Arthur's time came to an end, she would not only bury her husband, she would bury the memory of the daughter she once loved. For days after learning the truth, Marianne felt as if the ground beneath her had crumbled. Her husband's breath grew weaker by the hour, and yet another storm raged outside the hospital walls, the betrayal of her own flesh and blood. She wanted to scream, to collapse, but she knew that grief could wait. Survival could not. One morning, after Arthur drifted into uneasy sleep, Marianne excused herself and walked outside the hospital, her hands trembling around a notebook she had begun to fill with hurried thoughts. For the first time in weeks, her eyes were not on her husband's monitor but on the future, and the fight ahead. Her first call was to a lawyer recommended by an old friend. The lawyer's voice was calm, steady, and precise. He explained what Marianne needed: proof of forgery, documentation of the loan, and any records showing that Sophia and Daniel had manipulated her financial state. "It won't be easy," he warned, "but if they've left a paper trail, and trust me, they always do, we can follow it." From there, Marianne contacted her bank. Sitting in the manager's office, she listened in disbelief as the woman slid copies of documents across the desk. Her name was there, her signature bold and confident, but Marianne knew she had never signed them. The sight made her stomach twist. The ink felt like fresh wounds, mocking her trust. She carefully gathered the copies, placing them in a neat folder, her determination sharpening with each page. But Marianne did not stop with legal and financial experts. She reached out to an elder protection agency, her voice firm despite the exhaustion in her bones. "My daughter forged my signature. She took my home. I won't let this be hidden." The caseworker on the line assured her that what happened was not only immoral, it was criminal. They would help her ensure justice was done. Still, one question gnawed at her: why risk everything for Daniel's company? What was so urgent, so consuming, that Sophia would gamble her mother's future for it? Marianne's nights at the hospital became a dual vigil, one for her husband, and one for the truth. Using her old skills from her years working in finance, she began digging into Green Horizon LLC. A quick search revealed a polished website filled with vague promises of sustainable growth and innovative green solutions. But beneath the glossy words, she sensed rot. With persistence, she tracked down old press releases, obscure filings, and whispers on professional forums. Former employees, bitter and weary, described a company that promised investors stability but shifted funds without explanation, leaving projects half-built and people unpaid. One ex-employee, after initial hesitation, finally sent her a string of emails, documents showing meetings where Daniel pushed for creative accounting to cover losses. As she read, Marianne felt a chill. This was bigger than just a reckless loan. Green Horizon LLC was a sinking ship, and Sophia had tied their family's future to its mast. By the time dawn broke outside the hospital window, Marianne had built her own arsenal: folders of bank statements, copies of forged signatures, testimonies from Daniel's former staff, and a growing resolve inside her chest. She closed her notebook and whispered to herself, "You took my trust, Sophia. But you will not take everything. Not without a fight." And in that moment, Marianne was no longer just a grieving wife. She became a strategist, a survivor, and a mother ready to wage war to reclaim her life. Marianne had always believed numbers told a story, and numbers never lied. During her career in finance, she had learned how to trace money the way others traced footsteps. Now, that same instinct guided her through the murky shadows of Daniel's enterprise. She began with late nights at her kitchen table, papers spread out like pieces of a puzzle. The accounts of Green Horizon LLC didn't add up: sudden transfers, unexplained gaps, inflated consulting fees. It was a company built on smoke and mirrors. But suspicions weren't enough. She needed voices, testimony, something undeniable. Through discreet phone calls and online searches, Marianne tracked down Daniel's former employees. Some ignored her messages. Others hung up the moment they heard his name. But a few, tired, bitter, and disillusioned, agreed to talk. One evening, she sat in a quiet cafe, notebook ready, as a young man named Patrick slid into the seat across from her. He had once been a project manager at Green Horizon. His eyes carried the weary look of someone betrayed. "Daniel promised us stability," Patrick said, his voice low. "He said we were building something revolutionary. But the truth? He funneled investor money into shell accounts, abandoned projects, and left people unpaid for months." Another contact, an older accountant named Lydia, broke down in tears over the phone. She had worked for the company for 3 years, only to watch Daniel redirect funds from sustainable energy projects into flashy but hollow ventures. "He didn't care about the staff," she whispered. "We were pawns. When we questioned the numbers, he threatened to fire us. Then he did." What struck Marianne most was not just the financial deceit, but the pattern of manipulation, the same pattern Sophia had fallen into. Daniel's charm, his ability to twist facts into visions of grandeur, had seduced not only investors but her daughter as well. Then came the breakthrough. A former assistant, hesitant at first, agreed to forward her a collection of emails and internal meeting notes. The language was damning, discussions about restructuring funds, creative adjustments, and delaying staff payments to preserve appearances. In one thread, Daniel even boasted about having Sophia's support in securing family assets to keep the company afloat. Marianne printed every page, slid them into plastic sleeves, and organized them into a thick binder. With each added document, the truth became clearer. Daniel was not just reckless, he was orchestrating fraud. And Sophia had tied her mother's home, her inheritance, and her future to that sinking ship. Late that night, Marianne sat by her husband's bedside once more, the binder resting on her lap. Arthur stirred, opening his tired eyes for a moment. She squeezed his hand gently and whispered, "Don't worry, my love. I see the truth now. And I'll make sure it comes to light." In the quiet hum of hospital machines, Marianne felt her grief sharpening into resolve. She was no longer stumbling through betrayal, she was pulling back the curtain, revealing the ugly machinery behind Daniel's lies. And with every page of evidence, she inched closer to exposing him and saving what little remained of her family's honor. Arthur's death left Marianne hollow. The silence of the house without his laughter, his gentle voice, his steady presence, it was a silence that pressed in on her like a suffocating weight. Neighbors came with flowers, whispered condolences, and casseroles she never touched. But the one who should have been there, her daughter, remained distant, appearing only with clipped words and restless eyes. Marianne thought grief would be the greatest burden she'd face. She was wrong. Within weeks, rumors began to spread, quiet at first, then louder. A neighbor mentioned, almost apologetically, "Sophia said you've been forgetting things. That you sometimes wander." Another acquaintance added, "She's worried about you. She says you're not yourself." It was a deliberate campaign, a soft poisoning of her reputation. Sophia painted her as a fragile widow, unraveling under grief. And Daniel, ever the strategist, whispered that her decline made her vulnerable, incapable of handling finances. The final blow came when Marianne received a formal notice. Sophia and Daniel had filed a petition for guardianship of her estate. They were not only questioning her competence, they were trying to strip her of control over her own life. For one night, Marianne allowed herself to weep. She sat in Arthur's old chair, clutching his sweater, whispering into the fabric, "They want to erase me, Arthur. Our daughter wants to erase me." The weight of betrayal was almost unbearable. But by morning, tears had dried into resolve. Marianne was not the frail, confused woman Sophia claimed she was. She had spent weeks building her case, and now it was time to wield it. When the lawyer representing Sophia and Daniel smugly presented the petition, Marianne's attorney calmly produced counter-evidence, medical records showing her sharp mental health, testimonies from friends and hospital staff who had seen her manage Arthur's care with clarity, and most damning of all, a binder thick with documents proving Sophia and Daniel's fraudulent schemes. But Marianne did not stop there. She presented emails where Daniel boasted of securing family assets through guardianship, and copies of forged loan papers that bore her falsified signature. The room grew tense as the facade began to crack. Sophia's face flushed with anger, Daniel's jaw tightened, but Marianne sat with quiet strength, her voice steady. "I may be a widow," she said, her eyes locking onto her daughter's, "but I am not weak. And I will not allow lies to define me." The judge, observing the stark contrast between Marianne's composure and Sophia's defensiveness, agreed to review the evidence in detail. What was meant to be a swift takeover of Marianne's assets had become the beginning of Sophia and Daniel's unraveling. Walking out of the courthouse, Marianne felt the ache of loss, but beneath it, a current of strength. They had underestimated her. They thought grief would make her blind, but instead, it had sharpened her vision. The confrontation was only beginning. And Marianne was ready for the war her own daughter had declared. The courthouse smelled faintly of varnished wood and old paper, its marble floors echoing with the footsteps of lawyers, clerks, and families seeking justice. Marianne walked through its doors with her head held high, though her heart pounded beneath her black dress. This was more than a hearing, it was the moment her truth would finally face her daughter's lies. Inside the courtroom, Sophia sat beside Daniel, their lawyer polished and confident. Sophia wore a tailored suit, her hair perfectly styled, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease when they met her mother's calm gaze. The judge entered, stern and deliberate. Papers shuffled, voices hushed. Then the battle began. Sophia's attorney painted Marianne as a grieving widow spiraling into confusion. He spoke of her emotional instability, her inability to manage assets, and her increasing forgetfulness. His words dripped with false sympathy, as though they were rescuers instead of predators. But Marianne's lawyer countered swiftly. "Your Honor," he said, placing a thick binder on the table, "we have evidence not of incompetence, but of calculated fraud." The judge examined the documents one by one. First came the mortgage papers, with Marianne's signature scrawled at the bottom. "That is not my handwriting," Marianne stated firmly. Her lawyer then presented samples of her authentic signature from bank cards, letters, even her marriage certificate. The differences were undeniable. Next came the notary stamps. At first glance, they seemed official. But under magnification, the discrepancies were obvious: altered dates, irregular seals. When the notary himself was called to testify, his voice shook. "I never signed these," he admitted. "I was approached to overlook certain details, but I refused. It seems my stamp was duplicated." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Daniel's jaw tightened, Sophia shifted nervously in her seat. Then the most damning evidence appeared: surveillance footage from the bank. The grainy video showed Sophia walking in with papers, her posture confident, her pen moving quickly across the page. Marianne was nowhere in sight. The judge leaned forward, his expression hardening. Finally, the notary who had initially refused Daniel's request spoke again, this time with greater courage. "They wanted me to push through documents without Marianne present. I told them it was illegal. They went elsewhere. I never imagined they'd go this far." The weight of evidence was crushing. Sophia's facade began to crack, her eyes darted between the judge, her lawyer, and her mother. Beads of sweat formed at her temple. When the judge asked her directly if she denied signing on her mother's behalf, her composure shattered. Her face flushed, her lips trembled, and for a moment, she looked like the frightened child Marianne once comforted after nightmares. But this nightmare, Marianne knew, was of her daughter's own making. The judge's gavel struck. "This case goes far beyond a guardianship dispute. The evidence presented suggests elder financial abuse, forgery, and fraud. This matter will be referred for criminal investigation." The words hung in the air like a verdict already delivered. Daniel clenched his fists, Sophia buried her face in her hands, and Marianne closed her eyes, letting out the breath she had been holding for months. As she left the courtroom, reporters whispered, lawyers murmured, but Marianne walked with quiet dignity. She had not only defended her sanity, she had exposed the truth. And now, justice was no longer a distant hope. It was in motion. The court hearing had been only the beginning. Once the evidence reached the hands of investigators, the ripple effect spread quickly. Daniel's empire, so carefully polished with promises of sustainability and green innovation, began to crumble overnight. Investors pulled out one after another, demanding answers. Contracts that once seemed unshakable dissolved under scrutiny, clients unwilling to be associated with scandal. By the end of the month, the office of Green Horizon LLC was eerily silent, desks abandoned, phones disconnected, a foreclosure notice taped to the glass door. The company that Daniel had boasted would change the world ended as a hollow shell, exposed for what it truly was, fraud. For Sophia, the collapse was even more personal. She had built her identity on Daniel's success, parading him as a visionary while staking her mother's future on his dream. Now, her name appeared in headlines not as the devoted daughter or ambitious wife, but as an accomplice in a financial scandal that preyed upon her own mother. The charges were devastating: mortgage fraud, forgery, and elder financial exploitation. Daniel was accused of orchestrating the scheme, but Sophia's signature was all over the documents. Both were summoned by prosecutors, their carefully constructed lives dissected under harsh fluorescent lights in interview rooms. At first, Daniel barked about conspiracy, insisting it was all a misunderstanding, that Marianne had approved everything. But the surveillance footage, the notary's testimony, and the mountain of emails left little room for denial. Sophia tried silence, then tears, but the evidence spoke louder. The trial loomed like a storm they could not escape. Their lawyer warned them bluntly: if they fought the charges, they would likely face years in prison. The evidence was airtight. The prosecutors had no intention of letting them walk away clean. And so, after weeks of tense negotiation, Sophia and Daniel accepted a plea deal. They admitted guilt in exchange for reduced sentences, probation, restitution, and the stain of criminal records that would shadow them for the rest of their lives. Marianne sat in the back of the courtroom the day they entered their plea. She felt no triumph, only a deep, aching sorrow. The daughter she had raised with lullabies and sacrifice now stood beside a disgraced husband, trading dignity for leniency. Marianne's heart broke all over again, but beneath the sorrow was relief. Relief that the lies were no longer hidden, that the law had named their betrayal for what it was. As Sophia's trembling voice echoed through the courtroom, "Guilty, Your Honor," Marianne closed her eyes. It was not victory she felt, but closure. The scheme had collapsed. And though the ruins were ugly, they were no longer hers to carry. The day Marianne handed over the keys to her old house, she stood on the front porch for a long while, tracing the familiar lines of the doorway with her eyes. This had been the place where she raised her daughter, where laughter once filled the halls, where birthdays and Christmas mornings had unfolded in a blur of ribbons and joy. But it was also the place where betrayal had rooted itself, where trust had been broken beyond repair. She whispered a quiet goodbye to the home, not with bitterness, but with acceptance. Then she turned her back to it, her step steady as she walked toward the future. Her new apartment wasn't grand. It was modest, with sunlit windows, white curtains that fluttered in the breeze, and walls she painted in soft earth tones. She named it New Castle, a fortress not of stone, but of resilience. Every piece of furniture she chose, every plant she placed on the windowsill, carried intention. It was her space, built from the ashes of loss, designed for peace rather than pretense. It didn't take long for the apartment to fill with life. Her grandchildren visited often, their laughter bouncing off the walls like music. They sprawled on the carpet with board games, painted her dining table with finger paint masterpieces, and curled up beside her for story time. Marianne found herself cooking again, not out of duty but joy: apple pies, Sunday roasts, simple meals that carried love in every bite. There were quiet evenings too, when she sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the city lights flicker. For the first time in years, she felt safe. No papers were being forged in secret. No schemes unfolded behind her back. The silence was not suffocating, it was freedom. Yet, there were scars. Sometimes she woke in the night, Arthur's absence pressing heavy on her chest. Sometimes she thought of Sophia, her once sweet daughter, and wondered if redemption was possible. But instead of drowning in grief, Marianne let those thoughts pass like clouds. They no longer had the power to chain her. She had reclaimed something far greater than a house or money, her self-worth. She was not a helpless widow, not a victim defined by her daughter's betrayal. She was a survivor, a grandmother, a woman who had fought for her dignity and won. On the balcony of Newcastle, as autumn leaves swirled in the breeze, Marianne whispered into the open air, "This is my life now. And it is enough." Despite the loss, despite the wounds, she had carved out a sanctuary of love, resilience, and peace. And in that space, she rediscovered not only freedom and strength, but herself.